So today we are with Stephen Pavlovich. Stephen is the CEO of Conversion, and Conversion are the UK's leading experimentation agency. They work with clients like Domino's, Just Eat, and a small company you may have heard of called Facebook. They've optimized websites and apps, done pricing, functionality, and new products. Basically, if it involves CRO, Stephen has probably done it at some point. Huge range of companies, right from SME to Fortune 500s across multiple continents, including a lot of work in e-commerce. So really excited to have this chat. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Amazing. So conversion rate optimization has been around for a while, would you say? Fair to say? But what's happening at the moment? Give us a state of the union in CRO.
Sure. So I think we're starting to see a lot of trends gathering pace at the minute. One of the ones that's most exciting is people are looking at the heart of conversion optimization, which is experimentation, this idea of A/B testing, and they're using that to apply it to solve not just questions like what's the best experience on our website, what should our shopping cart look like, but they're also applying that idea of experimentation to much bigger business questions as well, like what should our pricing policy be or our returns policy. How do we structure the website in a way that adds the most value to our customers? That is one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing. So we're working with a lot of our clients to test not just the customer experience, but also product, pricing, business strategy. So because A/B testing gives you that kind of data that you can't get anywhere else, and it means that we can test it on the website and use their audience, their customers, essentially as a way of testing out to get real data. It's 100 times better than asking someone in a survey, what do you think of X? Sure. You can stick it on a website and test it.
And see what happens.
Yeah.
And so bringing that to life for a second, is there a example, obviously you don't have to name names if you can't, but is there something where you've done some work around, let's say, returns, for example?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the best examples that we've had recently is helping a client to test a new product before they've even made it.
Okay.
So literally just by adding that product to the website and then seeing whether people try to add it to their cart or not. If they do, it shows demand for that, and we can measure how much demand is being shown for it. And it means that it's taking a product development cycle that is normally kind of 12 months work, investment and commitment before you can launch something. You can get that same sort of data in a matter of days and bypass all of that cost. So essentially see, would people buy this product? And if they would, then you invest in building it.
Makes a bit more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the plan.
So you think that the next sort of wave of this then is going to be, or should be, or is going to be the expansion of what is possible and what you should test?
Yeah, totally. Like people have been talking about data and big data and things like that for years and years and years, but actually most decisions that companies make today are maybe data informed, but not data driven. So like you will gather.
What does that mean for you?
So as in people will gather data often to research and maybe only just to justify a decision. When it comes to actually decisions, and normally people sat around a table and whoever is paid the most makes the call, and that's what they do. Yeah. Whereas if you look at some of the companies that are growing the quickest, that are performing the best, Amazon I think is a great example of that. Where Jeff Bezos will talk about how you should be spending for them billions of dollars on experimentation. You know, sometimes he says, I think in his annual statement a couple of weeks back, he said that Amazon should be prepared to lose a couple of $1 billion for essentially an experiment that goes wrong, an idea that doesn't work out. And this is for a company that does hundreds of billions of dollars in sales per year, so it kind of sounds, in that context, maybe about right. Like they're going to do some things like Kindle and AWS that work really well, and other things like the Amazon Fire Phone, if you remember that.
I do.
That work really badly. But you're not going to be able to get everything right. The important thing is that you take those kind of bets.
You're not going to hit home runs every time, basically, but you still got to swing for the fences if you want to get one.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So if for people listening then, I mean, let's suppose that they've maybe got, let's call it conversion optimization 1.0,
Yeah.
and now we're sort of talking about conversion optimization 2.0,
Yeah.
which is essentially, from what you're saying, the expansion and the application of methodologies used in 1.0 but applied to strategic or business-based cases. If I'm a retailer in conversion 1.0, what are the things I should be thinking about, or where should I look first to move to a conversion 2.0 model?
So I think the first place to start is to understand what are the questions about your business that you would want to explore, or if you can make any change to your business, what would it be? So look at what are the assumptions that you make, what is the case on your business just because that's where it's always been, what are the risks that you're going to take or the risks that you would take if you knew that you could take them with a safety net. So starting to explore these kind of ideas will often unlock some of those big opportunities. And I think thinking of it less as conversion rate optimization, because obviously what we're looking to do here is not necessarily optimize the conversion rate, it's more just experimentation, like taking that same methodology from science and applying it to business.
Got it.
But in terms of what they can do first, like some of the biggest opportunities for retailers will be things like many will be looking at discounting, for example, in terms of how you can move away from that, looking at shipping, returns policies, these kind of things. These are all things that you can A/B test. Like there was one example that Zalando did, this is going back a year or two now, where they A/B tested the returns slip that you get when you receive your order. And they wanted to see what would happen if we removed the return slip from the package. Would it decrease the number of customers who were returning their orders? So they ran an A/B test. For half of the audience, they removed the return slip, and for the other half, they kept it in. And they found that, sure enough, the people without the return slip would return their items far less frequently. But what they also found is that the lifetime value of that cohort of customers then dropped over time as well. So they decreased returns, but also decreased their customer loyalty. And so that's when you can probably tie it into one of the other recent trends, which is personalization. So not how do we apply the best average experience for everyone, but instead how do we create the best experience for individual users or segments of users instead. Because if you want to extrapolate that Zalando example even further, you can say, we know that removing the return slip will decrease returns, but it will also have this side effect of decreasing lifetime value. What if we only did it for our, I guess, the customers that we like the least?
Yeah, the ones we don't want to come back.
Because for every retailer, especially in fast fashion in particular, there'll be customers who will order multiple items and return most, if not sometimes all of them. There'll be, and by the time the retailers have to pay for picking the item, dispatching it, and then handling the returns as well, and getting the item back into stock, there'll be many customers who are loss-making for the brand. So you could say, okay, we're going to take the bottom 10% of our customers, and for those customers, we're going to remove the return slip. It's only a subtle change, but that could have quite a significant impact on returns for that cohort of users.
That's super cool. Because I mean, the concept I guess you're talking about there with the cohorts and the managing out of maybe your worst customers is quite a B2B. Traditionally, quite a B2B idea, right? Which is who in our client base are the squeaky wheels who pay us sod all, and then let's rack up their pricing until the point they leave, or ask them politely to leave. But it doesn't seem to be as prevalent in B2C.
No, that's a good point. I guess in B2C normally you talk about customer experience in terms of improving it.
Yeah, and making it nice for everyone.
Deteriorating it.
But I think it's a really interesting point, which is, that there are in e-com, as in almost any other industry, there are going to be your VIP customers, the 80%, 80-20, Pareto stuff, where I'm sure a lot of their revenue is driven by a very select group of customers.
Yeah.
And so to your point, with delivery cost, shipping, handling, all these other factors layered in, maybe you do want to make life a bit difficult for your
totally.
This is the first time we've thought about it like this, but I think it's a really interesting angle, so thank you. And then with the testing, I have a question on that in terms of if I'm in e-com at the moment, you said, one of the good ways of getting started with this experimentation philosophy, as we call it, is to think about what are the things I think we maybe take for granted, or that are sacred cows, or that just are the way they are, and all that stuff. What application is there to start from a customer experimentation point of view, if that makes sense? So Should the experiments always be driven by your personal perception on something?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is there an inherent risk that you're not testing the thing that really matters because you don't really think of it in that way?
It's a very fair point. I mean, when we start with any client, the first question that we want to understand is essentially what do we want people to do, and what's stopping them from doing it. So if we want people to place an order, that will normally involve them finding a product that they want and buying it with the least amount of friction and the highest amount of persuasive content possible. So normally they will fall down because of one of those 3 points. They can't find something that they want. It's too difficult to order, or they just don't care enough, essentially, or they don't want it enough. It's normally one of those 3 things. So typically the starting point for any conversion optimization project is understanding why people aren't ordering and which of those 3 factors is having the biggest impact on the customer experience. So you're right, the kind of questions that we've been talking about so far are more business focused than customer focused. But I think that's one of the shifts that we're seeing, which is that embrace of business experimentation alongside customer experience optimization, I guess. It's the balancing of the 2.
As in making sure that they're not just using A/B testing for UX, UI type improvements, but also okay, makes sense.
Exactly so.
So I guess just to cap this section, not cap it off necessarily, but just to summarise it for those listening, I think the key points there for you right now is thinking about if you're using A/B testing in a traditional way, should we say, what opportunities are there to apply an experimentation philosophy to other areas of your business, to other sections that perhaps in your industry are just taken for granted. Everyone has 30-day returns.
Exactly.
And how can you start to challenge those sacred cows and run low-risk experiments?
One thing to add is that the 2 can inform each other. Like for one e-com client, one thing that we found is that we were doing a bunch of testing on improving the persuasive content on the website. And we found that what we call lever, which is I guess how we cluster experiments around the same kind of core principle. One lever that always seemed to work really well was delivery. So we found out that no matter how we talked about delivery, whether it be the packaging, the speed, the cut-off time, all of this kind of stuff, every experiment that we ran on delivery worked. To the point where we were saying to the business, you should seriously consider improving the commercial proposition that you have around delivery. And so then we started working with them on testing other things like improved delivery speed, even same-day delivery, and these kind of concepts. And this is going back a few years before same-day was as much of a thing as it is today. And it was we kind of demonstrated the potential between the 2, which is really exciting to me. Like conversion optimization or experimentation, it's not just about tweaking and finessing the website. It's about improving the customer experience, learning more about your customer, and then using that insight to test ways to improve your business as well.
Nice. Great summary. Should have left that one to you. But yeah, no, I think this idea of macro experimentation is super, super interesting. So let's dig into that a little bit more. I guess one of the things I wanted to ask about is in terms of e-commerce, when you go in and you see, internal teams perhaps, from your experience, whether it's through projects or just through your knowledge of the industry, what's the competency set of your average kind of team in terms of their ability to run effective experimentation, and where do you tend to see there being gaps that would prevent them from doing more or from taking better advantage of it?
So it varies massively in our experience. I think there are a few different ways to look at it. One is in terms of the expertise, which has definitely increased over time, but I think there's still a huge opportunity there. So they will bring us in to advise on how to build an experimentation framework and strategy and roadmap, because ultimately we can't run all the tests that we want to run. We're going to be limited by traffic, resource, budgets, and so on. And because in conversion optimization there's never any shortage of ideas, everyone can have something to say or something that they want to test. So it means that the important thing is to prioritize the experiments that are going to have the biggest impact on your customers and informing your future roadmap. So getting that strategy right is super important, and we see that we've been working in this industry for 12 and a half years now, And in that time, it's definitely the expertise or the level of knowledge and awareness has definitely increased over time, but we're still a ways off where we should be, and that's across the board. Even in like some of the most sophisticated, highly regarded companies will still make sloppy mistakes in terms of experimentation. So there's that kind of there's that one side to it, and the other side is that ability to execute. So even if you've got that strategy in place, having the teams and the resource available to actually build, run, analyze, and iterate on the experiments is pretty challenging as well. I think for most companies that we work with, in particular, developers are a pretty scarce resource, and we know firsthand that developing for a client-side testing platform, like building a test, is very different to what a developer would normally do. So it means that it's quite a specialized resource to have. It's not something that you can just turn on and off as you need.
Okay.
So like when we hire a new developer at Conversion, we allow 3 months typically for us to train and onboard them and support them before we kind of let them loose on clients.
Wow.
And that's 3 months working in an agency that only does experimentation, working with a team of people who've been doing it for years and years and years. So client side, it's obviously much, much harder than that. Anyone can start building experiments, but to build some of the more complex, advanced experiments, it requires that specialist resource as well.
Yeah, I guess specifically as well, there's going to be that challenge. The more risky the experiment's perceived to be, does that ever come up for you? So, for example, with the return slips or the, systematically pissing off certain groups of customers or whatever the idea is there sometimes a culture barrier there?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think that's the hardest thing is that kind of, like you say, it's that cultural shift between a lot of the, I guess, brands that started out kind of pre-digital, they might be brick and mortar brands, don't necessarily have that same approach to being data-driven as a lot of the kind of more recently founded companies, and even those don't have the same approach. It's a very different thing to say, essentially, I don't know what the answer is, so let's test it on our customers and find out.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard for many companies to take that approach. It's slightly easier if you're a startup that was founded a couple of years ago and you kind of had that baked in from the start, but for an existing business to kind of pivot and move away from the higher up within the hierarchy you are, the more you know and the more decisions you're expected to take, to those companies saying, well, actually, we don't know what the answer is, so we're going to test it and find out. It's a very big
mindset shift. Yeah, okay. So there was the expertise, there was resource, and then culture.
Yeah.
Out of those three, if someone, one of our listeners is sitting thinking they have one or all of those problems, I mean, you can go through them in order, but is there anything that you've seen work well to try and overcome each of those potential barriers? Yeah,
I mean, culture is by its nature the hardest one to do, obviously, because it affects everyone, and everyone knows from all of the digital transformation projects that have failed how hard it is to undertake that kind of work. It becomes a hell of a lot easier if you have the results to go off, as in if you're an e-com business and you can say to the business, we wanted to move away from discounting, and one of our strategies was to increase the base price for all of our products, and we experimented at these 3 different price points, and then we measured our gross profit afterwards to see what impact the discounting had after we kind of met somewhere in the middle. Do you want to know what the results were? That's the kind. I appreciate I garbled how I explained that, but that's the kind of concept that a lot of people would be excited by.
Yeah.
If you say to them, we A/B tested 3 different colours for our add to basket button on the website, people are going to be less interested in that.
Sure.
So I think the culture can come from testing the stuff that's important. It should be a kind of a pull, not a push, in terms of building that culture. Because if you test what's important, what other people care about, then they will come to you to find out what the results were. If they see you as finessing the landing page or kind of tweaking the the basket in the checkout, then everyone's going to see it as like an optional extra, something that doesn't really add too much value. It should be about testing those fundamental business questions, and that's how you can then build the culture.
So make experimentation and the stuff you're experimenting on more exciting in the first place, and then you're more likely to, I guess, have people knocking at your door saying, "Hey, do you think we can test this, or can you help me with that?"
Exactly so. Because you're right. Like most A/B tests are boring. Like
buy now, buy right now.
Like we take a look. We can take a look at what other people are testing on their website and like, what happens if we move this nav from here to here and we swap it around, or if we change the position of the search box, or if we make it slightly bigger or slightly smaller. Like, yes, this stuff can have an impact, and yes, you should test it. But if that's the only thing that you do, then you might be in trouble. There should be some of the bigger bets that you're testing, where it's like, what would happen if we did X, where X is the most ludicrous thing that you can think of, but it might actually work. You can test it and find out. The worst thing that'll happen is that it won't work, and you'll screw things up for a week, and that's it. The best case is that it has a massive impact. It significantly reduces your CPA. It drives profit across the board, and it's not just there for a week; it's there indefinitely.
Yeah, and I guess the bigger things from your perspective, or again for people listening, would maybe be things like, the example of launching a product that doesn't exist, or playing with your proposition. Your whole like landing page, homepage kind of hero text, or like what do you actually do, to how you describe that and stuff like that. Is that kind of the
absolutely. I mean, you can do it. You can do it on near as damn it anything. Like you could, in theory, if you're, we got posed one question a year ago, which was if you had, what about if you have something like a Super Bowl ad, where you've only got one shot? How can you use experimentation to inform that?
Interesting.
Which is a tough question. Like, it's people talk about these. There are some changes that you can make that you can undo, and there are some that you can't. And this is probably one where you can't, which is going to be much harder to test.
Until next year.
Exactly. May not be a fair test. But even then, like, you can say, like, if you want to A/B test, if you want to A/B test a TV advert commercial, there are still different ways that you can do that. You can build up from A/B testing images or messages on Google Ads or paid social to understand what images or messages do people respond to best. You can then build up to A/B testing different short form ads on social, YouTube, whatever, and start to use that kind of insight to inform it. So it's not like you have to go from zero to a Super Bowl ad with nothing in between. It doesn't mean that you have to rely only on market research and surveys and that kind of sentiment analysis, which
focus group vibes,
which may or may not work. It's the same as a product example. You can ask someone in a focus group, would you buy this product? And everyone will say yes, and then when it comes to it, will they buy it? Maybe not. You can actually test these things in practice. Like if you test two different 30-second or 10-second ads or whatever on social and see which generates a high click-through rate, then that can give you the starting point for your advert. So it's not like you have to jump in completely cold, not knowing what's going to happen. You can build up to it in stages and use experimentation to inform that.
And I think it's an amazing example of taking something that seems like a super big investment, right, and B, in this particular instance, quite one hit.
Yeah.
But actually stripping down to the fundamentals, which is what kind of pictures do people like better, what kind of theme do people like better, what kind of music do people like better, what kind of, you can almost, I guess, reverse engineer
totally.
The Super Bowl advert of all time with also something really cool by incrementing and learning from each step.
Yeah,
that's really awesome. Reminds me actually of this analogy of, knocking over the smallest domino.
Yeah.
And there's some ridiculous statistic like that if you start with a domino sort of that's absolutely tiny, and then you increment the dominoes bigger, you can eventually knock one over like the size of a house or something by this first tiny one because the momentum gains.
That's a good analogy.
This is literally as you're running through that idea of stripping back, this is the massive domino, Super Bowl, scale right the way back, like what's that tiny domino? And how can we run a test that's meaningful but that informs what the next domino needs to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see it in product all the time, in that the kind of traditional waterfall approaches that you have this huge product development cycle, and then at the end you launch it and you find out if people care or not. And instead you're kind of moving that to the beginning. You do the minimum viable product. Do people care about this? If they do, you iterate on it. If they don't, you adapt it and you continue building until you might actually end up with a completely different product to the one that you would have built otherwise, but you're building something that your customers love, as opposed to making all of that investment and then risking it on one roll of the dice.
This just literally just popped in my head, someone asked you and see where it gets us, but do you think that e-commerce in terms of a skill set is sort of been outpaced by technology as a skill set? So, SaaS companies and other verticals that are very tech focused, do you think they are more predisposed and therefore likely to be successful? And that's why sort of maybe Amazon is a retailer run almost as a technology company rather than retailers run as retailers with a website?
I think it's fair to a degree. I mean, I think there's still obviously going to be those underlying e-com skills that you can't do without. I mean, I think it's funny, like when you started off saying like conversion optimization has been around for many, many years, like depending on how you want to define it, it could be one of the original books on this space was written in, I think, 1921, 1922, called Scientific Advertising.
I've read that, Claude Hopkins.
Yeah.
Great book.
Exactly. So it's a fantastic book. It talks about pretty much everything that we do today. The only thing that's different is that we test on websites. He tested on newspaper or magazine ads with a little coupon that you'd cut out.
Yeah, and different ones for like different. Yeah, amazing book.
And it's so I think fundamentally it's still the same. Like the technology has definitely shifted, but the approach, the methodology is still very much the same. And at the heart of it is understanding. It's two things really: understanding your customers and testing. If you've got those two things, you're going to be in a pretty good place, or certainly have a much bigger advantage than anybody else.
Just flipping it a slightly different way, because what you said when you brought up scientific advertising, if anyone who's listening and hasn't read that, thoroughly recommend it. It's not a long book either. It's quite small, but it's jam-packed with nuggets of wisdom from the 1920s that are still applicable today, which is no mean feat. So well done, Claude. But with that being said, do you actually feel like almost then technology has kind of blinded people? Is it sort of almost a shiny object in the room? Like what widget can we use? What thing can we use? Rather than the fundamentals, which is, do we understand our customers and how do we run a small experiment that helps us validate?
Yeah, it's very easy to work hard at being lazy at the moment. Like people can...
should get on a t-shirt like this. That's a really good quote, yeah.
People can spend all of their time looking at data in Salesforce or looking at Google Analytics, but will that actually teach you more about your customers? Probably not. If you look at Claude Hopkins or any of the kind of the advertising bibles by David Ogilvy or that kind of era, it's all about getting to understand the product and the customer, and you can only do that to a degree hiding behind a monitor, not talking to anybody. Mm-hmm. The best thing to do is to talk to customers, to understand their hesitations, their motivations and objections, if you can, face to face. So definitely the technology has enabled us to analyse at scale, but it has also become a crutch that people can rely on to avoid doing some of the harder, more awkward customer insight work that still needs to be done.
Nice. So I think for our listeners, one of maybe the things you could think about doing is maybe picking up the phone.
Totally, yeah.
There's a new if you are in e-commerce, when was the last time you actually spoke to a customer face to face or even on the phone? And I know from our world as well that customer support tickets, emails, there's lots of feedback there that's often siloed off in customer service world and never kind of feeds through to e-com. So I think there's a couple of areas there that, as you're saying, like you can't just figure out what your customers want from Google Analytics. It only tells you what's happened, not necessarily why. Yeah,
for sure. Like when we, it's not a retail example. When we started with the SaaS client a few years back in the US, on day one of the project, we asked them, what's the number one reason why all of these people are installing your product on a free trial, but they're not converting? And there was silence in the room, no one was really sure. So we've got a list of customers who are on a trial at the moment, and then started phone calling about 50 or so of them that afternoon, that evening in Santa Barbara. By the next day, we started to have a fairly good understanding of, okay, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the product. People aren't quite sure what it is when they sign up for a free trial, but they think they need it. And all this kind of insight that we wouldn't have gotten. Otherwise, we could then build on that to get a very strong understanding of the customers. And I appreciate that's SaaS where people are buying a product that they may not be familiar with, but it totally applies in retail as well, where customers will have choices both over the product that they buy and who they buy it from. So getting to understand what drives both of those choices is super important. You can't optimize your website without that.
And I guess as well, if you're sat here listening thinking, well, all well and good for Stephen, but I've got 100,000 customers a month, or I ship X number of SKUs or whatever. I think the point there that's really coming through from this conversation is, even if they just give you a little guidepost, right, then you go to your smallest domino and you go, oh, that's interesting, 5 people have said that they didn't buy because our delivery was crap. Maybe that's the first place we go to test, and then you validate. It's not necessarily that you then have to go and call everyone to validate the assumption.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And you can also, you shouldn't rely on any one research method in isolation, but you can also gather that insight at scale as well. You could put a survey quite easily on your shopping basket page. It's not a new idea, but to say, like, if people hesitate on that page, if they're on it for more than 10 seconds, you can ask them, like, what's the number one thing that's stopping you from completing your order? It's not a new technique by any means, but it's a fantastic way of getting insight. You can also ask customers who did buy, was there anything that made you hesitate before you completed your order today? And they might say, well, I really wanted to pay with Apple Pay because I was on my phone, but you didn't have it, so I had to come into work the next day and remember to order it when I had my wallet to hand or whatever. And so you can get some of these ideas as well coming through, so you can get a kind of regular stream of ideas, so you can say, okay, maybe we should test Apple Pay. Then you might think, well, okay, that could be quite a significant investment for us in terms of development-wise, and the backlog's really big, and we might not get around to it until next year. Maybe we should do the minimum viable product idea of testing it. So you could say, okay, we'll run a test for people who use a phone, an Apple iPhone, where on the shopping basket page we'll add a Pay with Apple Pay button, and if people tap on it, we'll say, really sorry, this feature's coming soon, but we can measure, like, is that 1% of customers on an iPhone? Is it 50%? Because I guarantee that your response is going to be different either way.
Yeah, definitely. And then you can maybe throw some weight behind rejigging the development roadmap.
Exactly. Yeah, you can start to add value to it.
Yeah, and put pounds and pence number on it rather than just banging the drum. I think something that's come through a number of times, which I just want to make sure our listeners really get and can hopefully take away, is that the test doesn't necessarily have to work end to end. You've given quite a few examples along the way of, there's a product that no one can actually buy, there's a payment method that no one can actually use, which sounds crazy, I think, when you first hear it, and maybe there's a bit of sticker shock almost. I know it's not sticker shock, but there's almost a bit like, what? Like, we're going to make something that doesn't work and put it into production? But I think your point is that if one of your challenges listening to this is that your developers are never available, never around, if there's never budget, whatever it is, then this is a kind of a quick and dirty but effective way of building a financial business case to try and free up some of that resource.
Normally the concern that people have is, like, isn't this going to annoy customers? Isn't this going to be damaging to our customer experience? Like, we're trying to improve the customer experience, not degrade it. And surely allowing people to think they can add something like that to their basket when they can't is going to annoy them, which is true to a degree. But then I guess ultimately the argument is you can only build and launch so many products or make so many changes to the website, and not all of them will improve your customer experience. So I'd much rather test 10 things like that and launch the one that works
Yeah.
that customers like, rather than taking a gamble and risk it being one of the other 9. So yes, it impacts the customer experience in the short term for a small minority of people, but it massively improves the investment that you're making in the long term.
Makes sense. Yeah, so you gotta, if you want to make an omelet, you gotta break some eggs.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
You love an analogy.
I do. I don't know why. Obviously, something to do with the day. Maybe it's because the sun's come out now. But yeah. Okay, so in terms of your toolkit, then, what do you? Well, I know we've said technology is not the be all and end all, and the key thing here is understanding your customer, and then experimentation culture was the second one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, experimenting. Yeah.
Experimenting. Cool. But everyone loves to know what's in your toolbox. So what's the Pavlovich go-to tools for conversion-related endeavors?
So, I mean, the essential is to have a testing platform.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be anything from Google Optimize, which is good for a free product and can scale up. Typically, I think a lot of our clients are on Optimizing. We've got many clients across Monotape, Qubit, Adobe Target, VWO as well. So there's a lot of different platforms to choose from. One of the newer platforms that we are seeing a lot of success with is Chameleon, which is a French platform, which is very strong A/B testing and AI capabilities within it. So there's a lot of products that customers can choose from within that. That's to actually run the A/B tests themselves. Obviously, to then inform the experimentation program, it comes down to data and insights. So on the data side, it's probably the platforms that you'd expect, like Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, looking at some third-party products to analyze and visualize data alongside that, depending on the client that we're working on, and then gathering additional sources of insight from whether that be platforms like Content Square, which is doing very, very well and getting a lot of traction, through to some of the remote user testing products as well. So there's nothing within it that's kind of going to blow people's minds necessarily. Like, the tool is only a tool. Like, it only gets you so far. Like, the difference is in what you test. Obviously, it's like if you give a pencil and a paper to two different people, you could get two very different quality of drawings at the end of it.
Picasso and probably myself would probably be.
I was going to say one of us.
Yeah, the opposite ends of the spectrum, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so a whole bunch of tools there. I mean, if people are using those tools, any of those tools you mentioned, the key thing, well, am I right in saying that for them, the key thing is actually going to be stepping back and thinking about the quality of the tests they're running on them rather than the technology?
Yeah, totally. Like, you could be spending thousands a month on the full Adobe suite and still run crap tests. Or you could be using a free platform like Google Optimize and running really strong tests. Like, the platform doesn't really make a massive difference if you're just getting started. If you've got a strong program underway, then you want a platform that essentially will not get in the way. So will allow you to test what you want, will allow you to target the users that you want, and will make it as easy as possible to do that. Because often what we find is that when we're using some of the less good platforms, and I'll be diplomatic, that we can often burn up a lot more time in actually building the experiment than we would do if we were using a kind of fully dedicated A/B testing experimentation platform.
Okay.
So the difference is you can have like one of those kind of comparison tables where it says, does it have this functionality and that, and you've got this kind of tick, tick, tick. Sometimes two products can have the same functionality but actually be very different in practice in terms of how you utilize them. So some can be much easier to use than others, which translates into, it takes you more time than
hours and less time running experiments.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So in terms of your research, it sounds like there's a huge amount out there. You mentioned Optimize, Chameleon, Content Square, Google Optimize, Adobe, and a bunch of others.
Yeah, sure.
But it's really the key though is it actually 100% necessary just out of interest to have one of these to get any sort of test running? Or
I mean, to A/B test, you'll either need a third-party platform or some kind of hand-rolled solution kind of baked in. Which, I mean, to be fair, some e-com platforms will have, like Demandware will have A/B testing functionality built in. Would we run that in isolation? Probably not.
Okay.
We'd still want a proper A/B testing platform alongside it.
Cool. But you don't necessarily need to break the bank, or even if you don't necessarily need to break the bank to get started if you haven't got started with A/B testing. If you're listening and you are way down the road and you're using Adobe, whatever to do your A/B testing, then I think the key thing for you is going to be around what are you testing and is there something more meaningful.
Yeah.
If you're to use your early example, using Adobe to figure out whether your button should be green or red, then you're probably not getting the best ROI from that particular investment. Fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Which colour should it be, John? No,
orange.
Yeah, merge the two. Okay, cool. We talked before about one of the biggest barriers being culture and creating this culture of experimentation. And one of the things you said was, don't do crap experiments.
Yeah,
is a good starting point. So don't experiment on really boring things. But if you were to go into an organisation and take them from a culture where perhaps they're doing traditional quote-unquote A/B testing on the boring stuff, what would be the steps you would suggest they take?
Sure.
Like step by step to move to a more overall experimentation framework?
So we use an experimentation framework internally where we start by defining the client's goal and then the KPIs, so how we're going to measure that. It's very easy to gloss over those two steps. But if we can understand the client's goal and ideally make it a smart goal, so do they want to increase revenue or profit? Do they want to expand into new markets? Do they want to increase margin? Like what's important to them, and by when do they want to achieve that? That's extremely important because everything cascades down from that essentially. When we've got that goal agreed, we can then define the KPIs that we use to measure our progress against that. With each of those KPIs, we can then break them down into like a KPI tree. So if we say, it's revenue, for example, is the goal that we're going to be focusing on, then revenue can break down into order conversion rates and AOV and users, for example. We can start to kind of break it down, and then those we could break down a little bit further. So we could start to kind of cascade those metrics down to the point where you've got some very tangible, easy to affect metrics that you can run tests on straight away.
So you're sort of just because that was, I think, really interesting and important. I just want to make sure I've understood it properly, so that everyone listening understood it properly, if I can speak. So the concept there is you need to start with a big and obvious generally goal, like revenue, for example.
Yeah.
But then you need to kind of peel back the onion, I guess, and go, what's the layer down from that? So maybe we want to look at in AOV and conversion and then go layer down and as far as you can go, or do you get to a point where you're like...
Yeah, I mean, as far as you can go, essentially, like the temptation that most people have and the mistake that a lot of people make is when they start A/B testing, they will get so excited about the idea that they can test anything that they just start chucking random experiments up. And win or lose, they don't necessarily move the needle on the bigger company objectives. And many companies don't move on from that sort of testing. We take a much more deliberate approach, which is we define the goal, which if it's revenue, it's okay, how much revenue and by when. Like we try to go into a little bit more detail than just revenue at all costs. Then we break it down into the metrics, break each of those down a little bit further, so we've got a full understanding of all of the different metrics that we can move that will add up to that overall goal. And then we start to define which audiences should we be focusing on. Like, do we want to test on everyone? Should we just test on mobile because desktop is so small? Do we want to separate out between new and returning customers, for example, and so on? So we kind of build up that customer understanding. Then we look at the areas. So which pages or elements on the website offer the biggest opportunity for experimentation? It doesn't even have to be limited to the website. It can include adverts, email marketing, the return slip that's in the package, all this sort of stuff you can test on as well. And then we look at what we call levers, which are the kind of, I mentioned earlier, these are like the core principles that we think affect user behavior. So it could be delivery speed and trust and social proof and ... Like these are the kind of core themes that we cluster experiments with.
Okay, cool.
Because that way, if we run a bunch of experiments, after a few months, we'll know, okay, these are the levers that work really well, these are the ones that don't, and we can iterate our strategy.
Okay.
If you're just throwing any old random crap up, often what happens is that you throw lots of different ideas into the same test. So if it wins or it loses, you're not really sure why or what to do next. Whereas if you've got this more deliberate approach, you can then start to learn more about your customers and what motivates them. And that's how you can build into that delivery example that I mentioned earlier, where you can start with a UI UX experiment and then lead into business experimentation as well.
Cool. So we testing culture, then goals first.
Yeah.
Specific, measurable, achievable. Breakdown, bucket or lever.
Yeah.
Run tests accordingly.
Yeah.
But in terms of once you've got that sort of, I guess, goal and strategy mapped out,
Yeah.
what about creating that cultural shift?
So yeah, the culture is a little bit different. So I guess what we were talking about just then is how we build up the framework that should sit at the heart of your experimentation.
Yeah.
To actually build a culture is a bit different. It's kind of what we were talking about a minute ago in terms of understanding what people care about. Like if you go to your merchandising team or your acquisitions team and understand like which goals are they driving towards, what are the questions that they've got that they aren't able to answer, finding out what they care about and then running experiments on that can be super important. Like if you've got a merchandising team and they want to know which products should we launch next, for example, could you use CRM to kind of use that kind of painted door technique that we were talking about earlier with the kind of fake products to include, you've got 100,000 people on your email list. Do we split it into 5 groups of 20,000 each and test out 5 potential products that we haven't launched but we might do in the future and just use that to measure intent, for example. So like find out what people care about and then test on that. Don't test stuff that you care about and then try and make them care about it. That's probably not going to work out as well.
So some empathy, and some selfless behaviour, perhaps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, I think the is there anyone you know of apart from perhaps, I mean, even if it is your clients, this whole, as you call it, painted door kind of fascinates me. I mean, this idea of like promoting a product that does not exist as yet.
Yeah.
Are people doing this right now? What have you seen work well? If you can share something. I know you mentioned one earlier, but are there companies who you would say, for our listeners, whether it's A/B experimentation or whether it's proper, strategy experimentation, that they should maybe go and look at and study?
So on the painted door side, yes, like lots of companies are using this. By its nature, it's not necessarily the kind of thing that they want to publicise, I guess. Because it's something that people can feel a little bit uneasy about, but it's a kind of insight that's invaluable, super quick, and you can't get it anywhere else. So it's hard to kind of see how companies are doing it. I know, so a few years back we did a lot of work with the Guardian newspaper website app, and that was really interesting in terms of how we used that approach there as well. I think there was one instance where we were working on both website and app and we could see that there wasn't parity between the two products. In other words, a functionality that would exist on one wouldn't exist on the other. And as each of those two products developed, it meant they were going in slightly different directions and that difference was becoming more and more stark. And so one thing that we were talking about with them was essentially like, there's one piece of functionality, I think it was like the read it later functionality, which existed on app. So if you're browsing the app and you see an ottolenghi recipe that you want to make later, you can save that to read later. But that functionality didn't exist on the web, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's a question essentially like, what should we do? Do we just build it on web and have parity between the two platforms? Do we not build it on web and build something else instead? Or do we add the icon on web And then if people tap on it, we say,
we need to build this.
yeah, essentially. So you'll often see examples like that in the wild. I think the Guardian's pretty good at testing that sort of stuff. By its nature, these aren't experiments that will be live for a particularly long period of time, so you don't tend to see them that often. But
so kind of get out, get the learnings.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Really interesting, really interesting. So I want to get into our standard kind of last few questions now that we ask every show.
Okay.
Don't worry, you don't need to be nervous. So the first question we always ask is when we're talking about CRO or more broadly experimentation.
Yeah.
What are the things that you see time and time again that prevent people from getting good results? What are the things that is most people's Achilles heel, the thing that they're doing and they don't realise that thing is stopping them from getting more from it? What is that?
There's probably two things. One is doing crap tests in the first place. Like if you're just going to test crap, you're not going to get anything at the other end.
Yeah.
Except crap. The other is, I guess, lousy statistical analysis. Like the whole point of A/B testing is that you are testing to see statistically significant differences. And so if you misapply the stats, then you're going to be kind of making out results, as it were. And so it's something that's a little bit harder to overcome. It's not the easiest thing to explain to other people, which is why it can be harder to spread that culture of experimentation within an organisation, because you don't have to build up that statistics 101 that goes with it, which can get in the way.
Is there a risk, just on that point of statistics, that if people don't understand either themselves or in their wider organisation or their colleagues or whoever, if they don't understand statistical significance as a concept, the platforms and so on, will they compensate for that, or can they still lead you astray?
To a degree, but yeah, it can certainly exacerbate it. Like in the past, we've run AA tests on a platform where both the control and the variation are the same, but you do it at the start of an engagement to ensure that all of the tracking events and so on is
perfect.
Is working correctly. We've seen examples where the platform will report this variation is 10% better than that with 95% statistical significance, which, yes, that could happen 1 in 20 times, I guess, but that should be slightly concerning. So if you're not applying the statistics correctly, if you're kind of checking in on the results every 30 seconds to see, are we significant yet, you're probably going to misapply the stats and get misleading results.
Is there somewhere where if someone wants to, I don't know, maybe brush up or hone up their statistical significance understanding, is there anything you recommend reading or anywhere you recommend going as kind of a good bastion of information?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of blog posts on that topic. Let me see what we can dig out and then share in the links after. If that's
we can pop those in the show notes. So we'll make sure we share those so you can. I will also be brushing up on my statistical significance. Should have paid more attention to GCSE maths, I'm sure. Okay, cool. Really good answer there. And then top secrets and tips. What's Mr. Pavlovich's top experimentation conversion nugget?
I could choose a really boring one, which is the boring answers are often the right ones, which is annoying.
No, go for it. Let's be right.
Like the boring one is like most people don't use a framework. They like I said earlier, they'll just test on anything that comes to mind, or they'll just throw all of their ideas in a hopper and then try and prioritize it and start working at the top and go down to the bottom and see how far they get, which is fine to a degree, but having an experimentation framework changes it so massively. It means that you run the experiments that are going to have the biggest impact most quickly. It means that you learn so much more about your customers. It means that you can share that insight with other people within the organisation too. It's very boring and process driven, but that kind of reflects my nature a little bit.
It's not true on the boring side. I've known this guy for a while.
So it's super important to have that at the heart of the work that you do. It grounds all of the experimentation that you do and allows you to scale it up so massively as well.
Amazing. So I think from framework really as well, with talking there about you have to know where that north is and have a clear route of getting there. And to your point, not coming up with a laundry list of, well, what if we check that and just started working through them top to whatever they came to mind. But starting with, as you said earlier, your goals and objectives, making sure they're measurable, making sure they're shared, I guess, across teams and so on, cascading down, and then using customer insight feedback, perhaps picking up the phone like we talked about earlier, or speaking to a customer, leaving the office to get in front of some people, and then use that combination of things to inform what should be tested first. And I think the other thing that I just want to make sure we cap off again is this idea of, if your developers are constantly, the no factory, because either they're super busy or they're developers, one of the two, normally both, then what can you do to create a example of that test, perhaps a dummy, a painted door, whatever, that then allows you to put pounds and pence and get, the right weight behind jigging that up. So I've taken your top secret tip and kind of recap most of your conversation. Apologies, but I kind of feel like it all flows so well together, Steve, which is great. So let's have then our parting thoughts. So what's one thing that everyone listening, because we've been through, covered a ton in this conversation, it's been awesome. But if our listeners are going to go away, get out of their car, come home from the gym, wherever they are listening to this, and do one thing to really start to move the needle and put something into practice today, what's that one thing? What's the golden bullet for today?
Can I do two? Two silver bullets instead of one golden?
You can do, we can downgrade but have double the power. It's fine. Two vampires instead of one.
So following up from that last point, we've shared a bunch of material on our experimentation framework and how we create it, and it's the same one that we use internally, and we've published a fairly long article about that on the blog.
Amazing.
So we can share the link with that as well. We're very keen for people to use it. We see it popping up in conferences and events and other people's decks, which is great to see, so please continue doing that. And the other thing is to go into detail on that question of, if you could test anything, what would it be? That's the favourite question that we love to ask new clients. And don't accept a kind of cop-out answer like, we'd test a new design for our homepage, or that sort of thing. What are the more radical ideas? If you could test anything, what would it be? And then find a way to test that.
Let your imagination run wild, basically. Do you think it's quite difficult, though, just quickly, do you think it's difficult for people to do that because they do get so ingrained into this standard A/B testing thing? Yeah,
totally. It's very hard to come up with those ideas in the first place, and it's even harder to get them signed off internally. But most A/B testing platforms have the ability to exclude certain cities or locations when you're testing them, so you can just exclude where your office is so that no one in the company has to know, and you just crack on.
Nice. Okay, so two parting thoughts. Parting?
Not that I'd recommend doing that.
Not quite a painted door, just like painted office door. Two parting thoughts then. One is check out Stephen and Conversion's experimentation framework. It is free, we'll put it in the show notes. You can take it and use it and never speak to Stephen if you never want to, or you can speak to him, I'm sure, talk to him about it, but it's free, go use it, why not? And the second thing was, I'm going to try and make sure I frame this in the exact same way as you did, but I can't remember the exact language.
Come up with radical ideas.
That's it, yes.
Don't do boring tests.
Be radical, be different. You remind me again, I'm going to use another story of a kid on a train yesterday. He said, "Daddy, do they race trains?" And I just thought, what an interesting question.
No, but they should.
Yes, and what an interesting question. And I think that, for me, was think about something a bit different.
Because, ultimately, if you're always testing the same stuff that your competitors are testing,
right,
or if you're just saying, I saw something on their site, we're going to test it on ours, if that's all you're doing, you're just going to get the same results that they do. That's the highest that you can achieve. Whereas if you're constantly testing new, radical, interesting ideas, and you're always trying to push the boundaries and find better ways to create an experience that works for your clients, then that's how you get the results that improve your performance, that allows you to buy more ads, increase your market share, and grow the business ultimately.
If you want to hit home run, got to swing for the fences.
There we
which
go.
I think was the exact area that we started. And on that
Right.
note, Stephen, you've been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much value. It's amazing to chat to you.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, guys.